There is a number that stops geneticists cold when they see it: 62%. It doesn't sound like much, but when you understand what that number means and what it says about every single person alive on this planet right now, it changes the way you see the entire human story. Dr. Sarah Tishkoff had spent 30 years sequencing African genomes at the University of Pennsylvania. 30 years of data, samples, populations, patterns. And when her team ran the numbers on a group of men from the wetlands of South Sudan, that number, 62%, showed up on her screen. She had seen it before. It still stopped her. Because here's what it means. The men of the Dinka people carry a Y chromosome so old, so close to the root of the entire human family tree, that every other male lineage on Earth, European, Arab, East Asian, South Asian, Indigenous American, every single branch is a mutation away from it. Not a variation, a departure. Let me say that again because it matters. Every man alive today carries a Y chromosome that branched off from the ancestral type the Dinka still carry. Your father's father's father, going back hundreds of thousands of years, at some point his line moved. The Dinka line never did. You are not watching a story about them. You are watching a story about what every other human being became after they stopped being like them. Among Dinka men, this ancient lineage, haplogroup A, appears at 62%. Among the newer, their nearest neighbors, it drops to 33%. Among North Africans, it falls below 5. Among Europeans, it's essentially gone. These aren't different branches of the same tree. Haplogroup A is the trunk. Everything else grew after someone walked away. This isn't just ancient history. This signal is alive right now in millions of living people, and one of them might be watching this video. A South Sudanese man living in Philadelphia once submitted a DNA test to one of the big genealogy services. The result came back flagged. No haplogroup could be assigned using the standard framework. A technician described his result in internal notes as pre-basal. The man asked what that meant. The technician said, "It means we don't have a category old enough for you." If you've ever wanted to understand where you actually come from, not where your family moved, but what you were before the first migration changed you, then subscribe, because this goes deeper than you think, and we are only at the surface. Actually, before we go any further, drop your country or region in the comments right now. Just one word, because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why the place you're sitting, wherever that is, has a direct genomic connection to the Sudd wetlands of South Sudan. You may not believe that yet. You will. And what comes next is the reason nobody expected this story to look the way it does. Go back 70,000 years. The Nile is not the thin river you see on modern maps. It's a braided network of channels feeding wetlands the size of a small continent. And for at least 200,000 years before this moment, those wetlands are already occupied. The people who would eventually be called the Dinka, or their direct genomic ancestors, were here, not passing through, not migrating in from somewhere else, here. And they had a name for the river. They called it Kir. Not a river they arrived at, not a river they discovered, the river that was already there when they were already there. There's no word in the Dinka language for origin that implies arrival from somewhere else. The concept doesn't exist linguistically because the experience doesn't exist historically. Now hold that thought, because here's where it gets strange. Dr. Sarah Tishkoff's 2009 study in Science, one of the largest genetic studies of African populations ever conducted, looked at over 3,000 individuals from 121 ethnic groups. And when her team needed a fixed reference point to measure everyone else's genetic drift, they chose 3 populations: the San of Southern Africa, the Mbuti of Central Africa, and the Dinka of Northeastern Africa. The Dinka were chosen not because they were unusual. They were chosen because they were stable. Their genomic signal had changed so little over such a long period of time that scientists could use them as a zero line, a fixed mark on a ruler against which everyone else's movement could be calculated. Hold on to that word, stable, because what it actually means for the Dinka is about to rewrite everything you just heard. Think about what reference population means in practice. It means the Dinka genome was used as a measuring instrument to answer questions about other populations. Their data was collected, their ancestry was mapped, and then, once the measurements were taken, the question of what their own history meant was set aside. You don't study the ruler, you study what the ruler measures. And yet that ruler, those people, that community, that ancient genomic signal is still there, unchanged, living in the Sudd beside the river they have always called home. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. In 2020, a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published ancient genome data recovered from Neolithic burial sites in the Nile Valley. When they ran the ancestral component analysis, the Dinka-related genomic signal came back older than any existing population model had prepared for. It didn't just push back a date, it challenged the question that every researcher had been asking, because the question everyone was asking was, where did people go? But the data from those graves was asking something else. It was asking, what about the people who never left? In 2015, archaeologists in the Ethiopian highlands pulled a tooth from a skeleton buried in a cave called Moda. The skeleton was 4,500 years old. It became the oldest complete human genome ever recovered from sub-Saharan Africa at that time. When the sequencing data came back, something didn't fit the existing model. Not because the data was wrong, because the model had been built without leaving room for what the data showed. Dr. Mary Prendergast at St. Louis University had been working on this specific question for years. In 2019, she and her team published a study in Science analyzing genome-wide data from 41 ancient individuals across East Africa, spanning the Stone Age, the Pastoral Neolithic, and the Iron Age. This discovery was published in 2019. Almost nobody outside the academic community talked about it, until now. What Prendergast's team found was this: the deep ancestral component most fully preserved in the Dinka, what geneticists loosely call the Nilo-Saharan signal, did not appear because of later mixing between populations. It was already there. Thousands of years before farmers arrived, thousands of years before herders arrived. It was the substrate that every subsequent wave of migration landed on top of. And here's where the standard story starts to break. We've been told, in every museum exhibit, every textbook diagram, that some humans stayed in Africa while the successful populations migrated outward and built civilizations elsewhere. But look at the genomic evidence more carefully. Every migration event reduced genetic diversity. Every time a group broke off and left, they took a smaller sample of the original signal with them. Every bottleneck, every founder effect, every new environment, each one trimmed the genetic signal a little further. Which means expansion wasn't enrichment. It was, by every genetic measure, a series of losses. The Dinka are not the people who failed to leave. They are the people who retained the most. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. In 2020, a study from Harvard Medical School reconstructed ancient population movements across sub-Saharan Africa. In their supplementary materials, not the abstract, the supplementary materials, the authors wrote that the Dinka-related ancestry represents the most ancient recoverable stratum in the East African record. Supplementary materials, the oldest human genetic signal in East Africa, the deepest stratum in the record, assigned to the section of the paper that most readers never open. There were 3 things buried in that sentence. The third one changes everything that comes after it, because what that signal belonged to is a population that has never been given a name. They moved through this region. They shaped its entire genomic landscape. They left descendants in millions of living people, and they are not listed in any database, assigned to any civilization, or connected to any artifact in any museum. They existed, they shaped us, and they have no name. The unnamed people left no name, but they left a frequency. 62% of Dinka men carry haplogroup AM13, the direct genomic descendant of whatever those unnamed people carried before the world rearranged itself around them. The Dinka didn't inherit this the way you inherit a surname. They are this signal. In a world where everything dilutes, that kind of persistence is not an accident. It is a structural fact that demands an explanation. But here's where it gets strange. Because the Dinka didn't preserve this signal through isolation. They had contact with neighboring populations. They traded, they mixed, and the signal still didn't dilute the way it was supposed to. Dr. Pontus Skoglund and Dr. David Reich at Harvard Medical School spent years modeling ancient African population structure. What they found was that the ancestral Nilo-Saharan component, most fully preserved in the Dinka, showed a stability across time that no other African population cluster could match. And critically, the gradient tells you something. Dinka, 62%, Nuer, 33, Shilluk, 53. Further east, below 10. This isn't isolation. This maps onto documented contact zones. The preservation was structural. Something in the demographic, geographic, and cultural architecture of Dinka life protected this signal in ways that pure geographic separation cannot explain. Now, haplogroup A is not just the oldest haplogroup found in the Dinka. It is the oldest haplogroup found anywhere. It is the root of the entire human Y chromosome tree. Every man alive on Earth, every single one, has a Y chromosome that branched away from this type at some point in the last 200,000 years. The Dinka branch never moved. Actually, if you watched our last video on the Nilotic genetic corridor, you already saw the first thread of this. What did you think? Did that change how you see the Nile as a migration route? Tell me in the comments. Then stay, because what comes in the next few segments is what that video was building toward. In Dinka cattle culture, the most prized animal in a herd is the one whose bloodline every other animal descends from. It doesn't live separately. It walks with the herd. Its value isn't rarity. Its value is that everything else came from it. In Dinka, there's a word for this, bil, the one from which others derive. They apply it to cattle. The genomic data now applies the same concept to the Dinka themselves. None of the scientists who ran these studies has used that specific word, but the data uses it every time someone looks at the frequency chart. And this is the point where this stops being a story about ancient history and starts being a story about something in living DNA right now. Because buried in that genome is something scientists weren't expecting to find. A pattern of genetic variation clustered near genes associated with immune response, thermoregulation, and environmental stress, appearing at frequencies that, in every other population studied, only show up after a major catastrophic event, a disease bottleneck, a climate collapse, an extinction near miss. The Dinka carry the biological memory of something their ancestors survived, and no one has yet named what that event was. The witness gene. That's what some researchers have started calling it, informally, not in published papers. A pattern of adaptive variation that only appears in populations that survived something specific and severe. The problem with the Dinka version of this signal is that there is no documented event to attach it to. No famine in the record. No epidemic in the archaeological layer. No collapse that history recorded. Which means either the event predates any written or material record, or the genome is the only surviving evidence that it happened at all. Dr. Tishkoff's 2019 study, published in Nature Communications, went further than haplogroup frequencies. Her team looked at adaptive variants across the full Dinka genome, and what they found was that certain traits visible in living Dinka bodies today were not random variation. They were the result of selection pressure sustained across thousands of years. Height regulation genes, limb proportion genes, thermoregulation genes. The Dinka body is not just a carrier of an old lineage. It is a physical record of specific adaptive events. The genome and the body are quite literally the same document. What they found next changed what the word survival means as a genetic concept. Here's what natural selection actually does when you strip away the textbook version. It doesn't produce winners. It produces survivors of the deaths of everyone else. Every physical trait in the Dinka that differs from neighboring populations, the height, the proportions, the thermal efficiency, those traits are monuments. They are what's left standing after the people who didn't carry those traits didn't make it. The Dinka body is built from the absence of those who couldn't build it. Manute Bol was born in Gogreel, South Sudan, in 1962. He stood 7 feet 7 inches tall and went on to play in the NBA, the tallest player in the league's history at that point. When a journalist asked him in 1988 why the Dinka were so tall, he said, "Because we were born near the river, and the river is old." He wasn't talking about biology. He was talking about duration, about continuity, about what happens to a people who stay in one place long enough for the land itself to shape them. Biology has since confirmed exactly that. Duration produces depth. Hold on to everything I just told you, because it's about to mean something completely different. Here's something that shouldn't surprise you, but probably will. On the other side of the world, in the Amazon basin, the Yanomami people of Brazil and Venezuela carry a genomic signal that stumped researchers for more than a decade, an ancestral component with no traceable migration pathway connecting it to any known population. A 2015 study identified a genetic affinity that should have been geographically impossible. The Dinka case is not unique. Scattered across the world are populations whose genomes are so old and so stable that every framework built to categorize them simply breaks. The Dinka are the clearest case. They are not the only one. And now we arrive at the thing that should unsettle you the most: the genetic distance between the Dinka, the Nuer, and the Shilluk, three peoples whose political divisions helped drive the South Sudanese civil war, whose conflict has killed hundreds of thousands of people since 2013, is smaller, by genomic measurement, than the genetic distance between any two nations in Western Europe. They are not rivals who happen to share geography. By the only measurement that reaches below language and politics and memory, they are the same people. The science has been published. Both sides know it exists. So how does that happen? How do three communities with near identical genomes, communities that science confirms are, at the deepest biological level, the same people, arrive at identities defined by violent opposition? The answer isn't in the DNA. The answer is in what happens when ancient populations with shared roots encounter modern frameworks, national borders, colonial administrative categories, ethnic classifications, that were built by people who arrived recently and needed the landscape sorted into manageable units. The genomic record says shared origin. The political record says what categories of difference can be manufactured from shared origin when the incentive exists to manufacture them. And yet, the populations used as the measuring instrument have never once been the subject of the measurement. Here is the thing that nobody wanted to say out loud. The entire Out of Africa analytical framework, the migration maps, the haplogroup trees, the human expansion narrative, was built using reference populations that had already migrated. The Dinka, the San, the Mbuti were used as calibration points. But every question the framework was designed to answer was oriented toward explaining populations that had dispersed. Why do Europeans look the way they do? Why did East Asian populations diverge when they did? What route did the ancestors of indigenous Americans take? Those are the questions that received the funding, the journal space, the museum exhibits. The populations that didn't migrate were used to measure other people's histories. Their own history was considered self-evident, which is the scientific community's polite way of saying it was considered not worth asking about. But here's where it gets strange, because the most radical challenge to this framework didn't come from a political argument. It came from an ancient burial site in Sudan. Every migration map you have ever seen was drawn by populations who left. The Dinka never left. This is not a small detail. This is the entire argument. Every arrow on every Out of Africa diagram points away from a center that is still occupied by people who are still alive in a place that is still called home. Science spent a century building a cathedral to human dispersal, and the people who never dispersed were placed quietly in the gift shop. One researcher said it better than I can. She wrote, "We are using African genomes as mirrors to see ourselves more clearly, while refusing to look at what the mirror is made of." The paper she wrote that in has been cited dozens of times. The framework she was critiquing is still in use. And now, here's the thing that inverts the entire story you've been told. The Out of Africa migration has been presented as the story of human success, expansion, conquest of new environments, the colonization of every continent. But read from the Dinka reference point, the genomic record tells a different story. Every migration event reduced genetic diversity. Every bottleneck, every founder effect, every new climate, every new continent, every new horizon that a group of humans crossed, each one trimmed the original signal a little further. The people who traveled furthest carry the least, not metaphorically, genetically, measurably. The further a population moved from the origin point, the smaller the slice of the original human genome they took with them. Expansion wasn't enrichment, it was loss. Repeated, incremental, irreversible loss. Stay with me, because this next part is the part this entire video was actually building toward, and it's not what you're expecting. If the people who traveled furthest carry the least, then the researchers running these studies, building these frameworks, writing these papers are, by definition, the populations with the greatest genomic distance from the signal they're measuring. The scientists studying the Dinka genome carry, on average, far less of the ancestral signal than the people they are describing. This is not an accusation. It is a measurement, and it has consequences. This episode was not made by Dinka researchers. The voice you're hearing does not carry haplogroup AM13. The papers cited, the studies referenced, the data presented here, none of it was written, led, or authorized by the community whose genome is the subject. The research is real, the findings are accurate, and this story is still being told about the Dinka, not by them. The gap between those two words, about and by, is not a production detail. That gap is the story. The absence of the Dinka voice from the apparatus describing the Dinka genome is the most precise summary of the problem this video has spent 20 minutes building toward. We're showing you a mirror. We are not the mirror. As of the most recent review of the published literature, no major genomic study of the Dinka or Nilotic populations has been designed or led by a South Sudanese researcher. The studies exist. The data exists. The implications of that data for Dinka land rights, political representation, and cultural continuity have not been published by anyone who carries those stakes. This is not a critique of the scientists who did this work. Many of them have spent careers trying to correct the institutional imbalances in African genetics research. It is a description of a structural condition. The population with the most ancient genomic record in the world has that record described, curated, and interpreted entirely by populations whose genomes are, by those same studies' own measurements, derivatives of the signal being described. The descendant is reading the ancestor's diary. The ancestor was not consulted about whether the diary should be published. What that community leader in Bor said when journalists told him the science had confirmed his people were among the most ancestrally significant on Earth, that answer is the reason this segment exists. In 2016, a Dinka elder in Bor, South Sudan, was told about the genomic studies. A journalist explained what the science said, that his people's genetic signal was among the oldest and most preserved on Earth. He listened, and he said, "They tell us we are old. We know we are old. The question is what they plan to do with that knowledge, because so far they have done it without us. Now I need to show you something that the genomic record found when researchers modeled what the ancestral Dinka-related population actually looked like. Before any migration, before any dispersal, before any of the branches grew. What they found, when they ran the numbers backwards, was a population that at some point in the deep African past passed through a near-extinction event. A bottleneck so severe that the number of males contributing to the next generation may have dropped to the hundreds, maybe fewer. One valley, one winter, one migration that almost didn't happen. If it had gone differently, if that group hadn't crossed that distance, hadn't survived that season, the Y chromosome tree would have no branches. There would have been nothing to branch from. The billions of people alive on Earth today exist because one small group of people in one specific place made it through something that almost killed them all. Here's what the data shows about what that bottleneck actually cost. The same genomic signal that makes the Dinka so significant to human origins research also makes them uniquely vulnerable to something that is happening right now. The very thing that makes them irreplaceable, that genomic stability, that's the thing that disappears the fastest. And right now, it is disappearing. Displacement, conflict, land loss. The South Sudanese Civil War, which began in 2013 and has never fully ended, has scattered Dinka communities across 4 continents. The diaspora in Minnesota alone numbers in the tens of thousands. And every generation born outside the Sudd, removed from the cultural structures and marriage patterns that helped preserve that genomic signal for 200,000 years, is one generation closer to the dilution that 70,000 years of migrations couldn't achieve. The genome is not the people. The people are not reducible to their DNA, but the specific ancestral signal the Dinka carry, the living record of the deepest human past, is not infinitely renewable. Once it dilutes past a certain threshold, the most ancient stratum in the East African genomic record becomes unrecoverable. The archive doesn't burn, it just becomes unreadable. There's something else in that genome that nobody talks about. The adaptive markers associated with the stress response and immune function clusters, the ones that appeared in frequencies suggesting a major ancient catastrophe, Those same markers show up at lower frequencies in populations across East Africa, the Nile Valley, and the Horn of Africa. Not just in Dinka, in Somali populations, in Ethiopian Highlander groups, in communities along the Sudanese Nile, all carrying a faint biological echo of the same ancient event, all descended in part from the same original signal. Think about that for a second. The ancient catastrophe that the Dinka genome remembers, whatever it was, left a faint biological trace in populations spread across an entire region of the world. They are separated today by language, by religion, by centuries of political conflict. But in the deepest layer of their genomes, they are all responding to the same ancient wound. And that wound has a specific, measurable shape. It has a frequency. It has a distribution. It maps onto living bodies. It maps onto you. Because wherever you are from, if your ancestry includes any population that has ever had contact with the Nile Valley or East Africa, there is a statistical possibility that you carry a trace of this signal. Not haplogroup A, not the full ancestral signature, but a fragment, a fraction of a fraction. The question that no published study has yet answered is this: what does it mean to carry the memory of an event you know nothing about? What does it mean that the catastrophe is in the biology, but not in the story? The Sudd is one of the largest wetlands on Earth. It sits in the heart of South Sudan, fed by the White Nile, covering an area that expands and contracts with the seasons, sometimes larger than England, sometimes smaller. It has been here, in approximately this form, for longer than any human institution, any language family, any political border. The Dinka have lived beside it for as long as there is any record of anyone living anywhere near it. And the Sudd has not changed. You can compare satellite photographs from 1974 to photographs from today, and the Sudd looks essentially the same. The same vast brown water, the same papyrus banks, the same flat horizon. The governments of Sudan and South Sudan have both tried to drain parts of it for agricultural projects. The water remains. This is the place the genomic signal comes from. Not metaphorically, literally. The Y chromosome that researchers at Penn and Harvard and Khartoum have been mapping and modeling and publishing papers about, it comes from here, from this water, from the people who have lived beside this water since before the first human migration changed anything. And here is what science has not yet resolved, and may not resolve for another generation. We can sequence the Dinka genome. We can map its age, measure its stability, calculate its divergence from every other human lineage, write papers about its significance. We can explain, in technical detail, why the Dinka signal represents the most ancient recoverable stratum in the East African genomic record. We can do all of that. We have done all of that. What we cannot do, what no paper has done, what no study has funded, what no institution has prioritized, is ask the Dinka what this means to them. What it means to be told by the descendants of people who left that you are the most important reference point in the story of where everyone came from. Think about the scale of that. For 200,000 years, give or take, the Dinka and their genomic ancestors stayed. Every other human population on Earth, every one of us watching this video, from wherever we are watching it, descends from people who left. We are all, in the most literal genomic sense, the children of departure. The Dinka are the children of continuity. We built the science, we drew the maps, we ran the models, we published the papers, and we used their genome as the fixed point from which all of our measurements were taken, without once stopping to ask what the fixed point might have to say about the people doing the measuring. That elder in Boer said it in one sentence: "They tell us we are old. We know we are old." You may carry a fragment of this signal. You may not, but you exist. Every person alive on this planet exists because somewhere in the deep African past, a small group of people survived something that almost ended the human story before it had fully begun. And the people who carry the clearest record of that survival are still here, still in the Sudd, still beside the river they have always called Kir. The science will keep publishing. The migrations will keep being mapped. The papers will keep appearing in journals that most of those people will never read. And the water in the Sudd will keep moving. The same water, the same direction, the same flat light at dusk, carrying a record that no sequencing machine made and no institution owns. That includes you, wherever you are watching this from. The archive is still open. We just haven't learned how to read it yet.